Good afternoon to the non-personnel services forecasting at the budget line of business intro to budget 2024 virtual forum. I'm your host today. My name is Janice Butler. I am the SME Senior Advisor for the Program Management Office, the Budget LoB PMO. We work with 27 partner agencies, budget offices to develop modern, adaptable, and cost-effective solutions for the federal budget community, processes, technology, and training needs. I will be managing the chat box today. If you have any questions, please include them in the chat box for us and any questions you have for our presenters today. Until then, please remain on mute and off webcam while the presenters are speaking. This will assist us with reducing background noise. This is our last session of the spring forum today. We will be sending out a post-session survey at the end of this session, and we would like for your feedback. If you attend one session or multiple sessions, we appreciate your feedback to help us improve upcoming training or any other training that you're interested in. I now will introduce our speakers. Today we have Andrew Pavord, aka Andy. He's the founder of the Federal Consultant Allowance, has led budget processes for the DC government, the U.S. Small Business Administration, and the U.S. Department of Treasury. He's also the training coordinator for Budget Line of Business. Also, we have with us Rick Taylor. He served over 34 years in the fields of financial management and budgeting for programs in defense, law enforcement, regulatory, and scientific agencies. He has extensive experiences in federal working capital fund and appropriation. Also today we have with us ASL interpreters, Antonio Goodwin, and we also have Renee. Again, thank you for joining us. Andy and Rick, are you ready?
We're ready.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Janice. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you said, it's the non-personnel services forecasting class. So we'll go ahead and get started. These are the objectives of what we want to cover today. And all the sections, will have some elements in them that are common to the forecasting class we did yesterday. So those parts might be a little bit of a review, but we'll try to keep the content fresh, and also we'll go into the non-personnel side of things. So first, we always like to review definitions to make sure we're using common terms and make sure we all understand the words the same way. Then we'll explain what the difference is between a schedule or a plan and a forecast. Next, we'll describe the uses of non-personnel cost forecasting. Discuss the unique nature of non-personnel cost forecasting, things that are different about it versus, personnel or other forecasting areas. Explore the forecasting cycle. What does that mean? Where does it start? What are the steps? Discuss how to get started on your forecast if you need to do this, and then provide some tips on building a forecasting model and other sort of tactical techniques. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The definitions. So the first one we want to go over is an obligation. And, it's kind of basic, but, again, we're kind of level setting. We want to make sure we're all on the same page. An obligation is an action that creates a binding agreement that will legally obligate the federal government to pay someone. That can be a contractor, employee pay, a grant, or a loan. But it really means there's been some legal action that makes the government responsible for paying someone when they perform. A commitment, on the other hand, is a management reservation of funds in contemplation of future actions, so like an obligation. So it sets aside money, different than being completely unencumbered or an available balance, but it doesn't have the legal test of an obligation. It can be undone fairly easily. Budget object classes are, of course, you're probably familiar with these. A classification system that presents obligations by the items or services purchased by the federal government according to their initial purpose, not the end product or service. And that's important. That definition is mostly out of the OMB 811 guidance. The non-personnel services costs are concentrated in BOCs 21 through 44. And those are costs incurred for actions outside the pay of government employees and related benefits. So it's just about all those other things other than paying the employees and their benefits: travel, contracts, supplies, equipment, land, all those sort of things all fall on the non-personnel side. And a continuing resolution, I don't know, somebody, you may a few people might have heard of that in the past. But it's an appropriation which provides budget authority to federal agencies in continue operations when Congress and the president have not provided a regular appropriation. So as we're living with the last, more than 20 years, every year, there's at least a few CRs, if not ones for the entire federal government, that carry over the appropriation language and amounts from the previous years until Congress can pass a full year appropriation. Now, in some years, some agencies have got a CR for the full year, and that's kind of another wrinkle on there. But the big thing in this area that is a continuing resolution prohibits new starts or programs or activities or changes that have not been previously requested or approved by Congress. And that's really what is the important thing in the non-personnel side. Personnel as well, but the no new starts is what really kind of makes CRs troublesome, I'll say. Okay. Now let's talk about forecasting. So what's the difference between a forecast and a plan or a schedule? There's all sort of words that mean the same, but what's the difference? And we were trying to lay that out real strongly. A schedule or a plan lays out when events or actions are desired to occur. The agency has a goal. They want to deploy a new email system by the end of the fiscal year. Okay? A forecast portrays when events are likely to occur based on experience and projections of where existing or changed processes can achieve those events. So we might look back and say, that the agency's never done an IT system deployment of this magnitude or complexity, and it's never done any deployment that rapidly. And so that kind of calls into question, the forecast says, can you really get there from here? And it's important because it's based on historical observation, research, getting behind, what's happened in the past. And, maybe the future can be different with a change process or, new people involved. But the forecast says this is kind of what's happened in the past in similar situations. Ideally, a forecast is done independently of the schedule or plan to exactly give it that sort of validation or not, to say, well, the plan may be to do this, but a forecast says it's going to be tough to get there or get that accomplished in that time frame unless we do something new or innovative we haven't done before. So a good forecast and plan are complementary in that they strengthen each other. But so that's the basic idea of the difference. They both have their role, but we want to make sure that we're speaking of which one, and which one we're using in the appropriate situations. So next thing is the cycle. So the forecasting cycle, what does it look like? So we'll talk about this, and it really is a cycle. As you start it, you complete certain steps, and then you come around and start it again. So it begins with collecting historical and actual data, as I said, and getting an understanding of what that data is telling us, what the time frames or the timing of events. Do things, or something that happens every summertime in your agency. Maybe, you're like the National Park Service and your user traffic goes way up in certain seasons and is less in some others in certain areas. Are you like the census and every 10 years you have to do this big effort, but between those years it's a little bit different in your operations. So understanding that background and that, what's the historical background and the data is very important. And that's really where it all starts. And then the information learned in the previous step is used to compile the forecast for the upcoming periods or fiscal years. So it's really historical data plus new information and maybe changes, that have modified what's happened in the past, give us that forecast for the future. So we're learning from the past. We're not necessarily bound by it, but we, definitely informs our thinking about what's possible or what's likely to happen in the future. Then once you have that, you move into a phase where you combine newer actual data. So let's say you've started the fiscal year, you've got a few months into it, and now you've got actual data to compare to the forecast for that fiscal year. And you can compare and see how well a forecast was predicting future behavior. It's never going to be exact, And if it is, that's, great for you, but it will probably vary at some point. But it's to look at those differences and see, where the differences are and what's causing them. Variance analysis, looking at the deltas or the changes and understanding what's really happening in the actuals that it wasn't captured by the forecast. The last step before it kind of cycles through again is to take those changes that have occurred in actuality and revise the forecast. It's like a ship captain. The ship is here, and now the current is going a different direction at a different speed. How do we modify our behavior to still get to the goal or the destination we want to get to? So we've got to modify things based on, we had a forecast, we had a course we wanted to sail, but things have changed since we predicted that, and now we adapt to it with the goal of still getting to the same place. We check the chat for any questions. Okay. If there's any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll usually get to them at the end of each slide. Thank you. So what do we really use this, forecasting, non-personnel forecasting for? So, budgeting for overall non-personnel costs is very important, especially in agencies that have a large element of those. If they have major acquisition programs or grant or loan programs, maybe this side of their budget, the non-personnel side, might be, larger in dollar value than their staffing side. It just depends on the agency. Of course, the budget requirements are for max and the congressional justifications. How do you come up with your numbers that go in those systems to make your budget request? It can indicate potential funding shortfalls or imbalances or surpluses. We don't have enough funding to do this thing we want to do, to buy this equipment or to start this implementation program. And it can point that out to say, that might be the goal, but the forecast says, the funding stream is not going to be sufficient to meet that goal. It can drive decisions in areas like production rates or amount of travel or contract support resources. Do you have enough funding on hand to, allow a given group of people, let's say, to go to a conference or to do some a contract support initiative? Maybe you're looking at replacing some of your support or recompeting a contract, and you need some funding that overlaps with your existing contract to make that happen. Forecasting that out can show you maybe where those conflicts are or where those kind of overlaps are that additional funding is going to be needed for. Also, it ensures compliance with legislative requirements, such that you might have some agencies have had limits on certain BOCs. I worked at an agency for years that once our travel budget was set in the president's budget, the travel amount in BOC 21, we could only change that very small, a few percentage points, without having to request a reprogramming from Congress. So having a good projection of our travel needs was very important because we didn't want to have to go back to Congress unless it was absolutely necessary. But it's also not unusual for Congress to put requirements in reports and sometimes even appropriations language. There are agencies I've seen that have specific staffing targets or specific performance targets in their appropriation language. And so therefore they must comply with those or run the risk of being cited as violating the Appropriations Act. If it's in the report language, it's a little less, impactful. It's not in the law, but it's still important for the agency to work with Congress and the other stakeholders to achieve those or be able to explain why those weren't achieved. Some more uses also include, it's formulating your budget requests in-house. How do you come up with the figures you need to request, from your bureau or your department, or OMB, what numbers you're going to use for different budget requests. So it's important for that. It's important for the operating plan, or if you're not familiar, the operating plan is kind of a fresh look at your budget requirements just before or at the beginning of a fiscal year, because the budget was done 2 years before, and so the operating plan is an opportunity to take a fresh look at things, incorporate any new data. Maybe you got a different funding level from the House or Senate than what you asked for in the president's budget. The operating plan is an opportunity to take in that new information and figure out sort of what your next steps are going to be. And then lastly, in execution monitoring. The forecast is what you measure against. The operating plan forecast become kind of one and the same. It's what you measure your operations against, your actuals, and decide what adjustments are needed during the fiscal year to achieve the same outcomes or as close to them as the agency can get. So, let's understand sort of the nature of the beast of forecasting. Just go hand in hand with a forecast. No matter how many factors you include or how much data you gather or how rigorous your technique, any of those things, it's not going to be perfect. The forecast is not going to perfectly predict the future. And boy, it'd be great if it would, but it's just not likely to happen. And it's also important to remember that when you're forecasting large dollar values, that even a very, very small, difference, generates some meaningful numbers. For example, if you've got, a contracts budget of $2 billion and your forecast is 99.9% accurate, then that difference is still going to be $2 million, real money. I mean, even in agencies with billions of dollars in budget, $2 million is still enough to kind of get people excited usually. And so it's just the nature of forecasting. You don't have a perfect crystal ball into the future. I like to think of them this way. Weather forecasts are called forecasts, not weather plans. And it's because, the forecasters are using history and the available data they have and, what performance or behavior they've seen of storms and things in the past to predict the future. But one thing to keep in mind when you look at a hurricane chart, when that hurricane is 5 days away from the coast, the expected landfall, which is a forecast, they use that, that cone they put on the maps. Well, that cone is typically based on a circle with a diameter of 400 miles. And that's over 126,000 square miles that they're saying, the center of that hurricane is likely to come in our forecast somewhere in that range. And so you can imagine that that's a big area that's still, it's all within their forecast, but it matters a lot whether it hits Charleston, or Norfolk, but those two might be in the same, forecast cone. For your forecast, there has to be some core assumptions. You've just got to guess, educated and informed as best as possible, but you've got to guess when things are going to happen. When is a contract going to be awarded? And that will greatly influence the outcome. The bigger the contract, the bigger the impact. And so if you think a contract's going to be awarded in June, and for some reason it's delayed, for acquisition reasons, or maybe the CR was late and things couldn't get started, that assumption changing, if it slips back a few months, is going to probably radically change your forecast. And that's that part of incorporating new information in the cycle that we talked about a minute ago. But you just have to make those assumptions, document them and explain them. But those are going to drive the forecast to a great deal, and you've got to be able to adjust them when you can. If you were in the class yesterday about personnel forecasting, one of the points we made is that leadership has very little control over events in the personnel side of things. When people are hired is the outcome of a long process. When people leave the agency is typically up to them, whether they retire or move on to a new position or agency. So it's out of leadership's control. Non-personnel is a little more under leadership control. I'm not going to say it's 100% because things like contract award protests occur or CRs go on, things of that nature. But there's a little greater degree of control on the non-personnel side to dictate, or decide when events are going to occur. It's not perfect, but there's a little bit more. So that's one of the differences between personnel and non-personnel. The other thing that's true of both forecasts is that once time is passed, it cannot be recaptured. If the contract was supposed to be awarded in June and it didn't happen, especially if it's a cost type contract, maybe now some of the funding requested for that contract will no longer be needed in this fiscal year. And if it's a 1-year appropriation, now the agency's faced with a decision on what to do with those freed up resources. They don't want to just let them lapse because of the impact of that, but they need to find a good and purposeful use of that funding to move forward with things. If travel is delayed, somebody can't go to a conference, it's not like they can go 3 weeks later, the conference is over, there's no need for it. And so that has the same effect of time can mean everything, it can't always be made up for. So let's take a break and ask a question, and please put your answers in the chat. So describe the difference between a forecast and a plan. I like that. Forecast is likely, plan is desire. Plan is what you'd like to happen. Forecast is what might actually happen. Forecast how we have taco ingredients. Plan is this is how we will make a taco. Okay. The forecast is what you hope to do. The plan is what you do. Is maybe a little, I'd word it a little differently, but yeah, the plan is what your goals, your desires, what you want to have happen in time. The forecast, says when is that likely to occur? Okay, great. Thanks for those responses. We're talking about tacos, just make me hungry. But a schedule or a plan lays out when events are desired to occur, and a forecast portrays when they're likely to occur based on experience and projections. So we got mostly the idea about that. So there's important principles about forecasting. They kind of reinforce what we've talked about, in a different way. So one of the differences to think probabilistically and not deterministically. So what do those mean if you haven't heard those before? Probabilistically is what's the probability of something occurring? What's the chances of it occurring on this date? It might be 80%, it might be 20%, but I'll say a real sort of hard-nosed look at when is this likely to occur. Deterministically says this is when I want it to occur. I'm going to do something at a given point in time in the future, and that's what I want it to happen. That's deterministically. It doesn't take into account chances or necessarily. It's not, hopefully not completely devoid of reality, but it's much more a goal or a desire. Making forecasts comes with the nature of short-term forecasts are likely to be more accurate than long-term forecasts. What I may do the rest of today, I can probably predict pretty accurately. What I might do, on, a date 6 months from now is probably less accurate. Other things can happen. Other things can occur in the meantime. My goals, my priorities might change. So a longer term forecast just inherently is going to be less accurate than shorter ones. And budget, anybody who's tried to do, BY plus 5 budgeting, those out years start to get really kind of soft and squishy because so many things can happen. You can make assumptions, like as we said in the forecast, but a lot of things can happen between now and then. And the important other principle is you've got to reforecast when you get new information. I mean, sticking with a forecast that now is overcome by events, if your forecast included the assumption of a 3% pay raise and Congress passed a 6% pay raise, well, then you've got to incorporate that new information, or by definition, the forecast is going to be broken. Some more principles are a forecast, and this comes from the reference on the screen. A forecast is a calculation about the future that includes both a range and a probability of the range occurring. So think of it as a sense that, if there's a lot of uncertainty, there might be a larger range and a lower, well, we think it's going to come in somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. Maybe it's a new thing that you've never done before, and so you don't really have good history. So it's a softer forecast than something like, oh, we've bought these components 50 times in the last 10 years, and we have good understanding of the market pricing structure. We have good competition. We can pretty confidently say what it's going to cost. So that range would be a lot narrower. And it's driven by, those deviations from plan. What's happened in the meantime? Black swan events like COVID obviously destroyed all sorts of forecasts that never happened before. But at the same time, are there things that you can predict for, as I said, seasonality in your budget or your operating environment, or recurring things that happen otherwise, or market-driven things? Those things can probably be incorporated in the forecast fairly consistently. And of course, timing issues, again, if you've seen contract awards vary a lot over time, that's going to raise the uncertainty or the range in your forecast. But if they're pretty solid, they occur pretty close to when they were originally forecasted, then, that improves that probability they'll occur at that same time. The probability, like anything, is driven by uncertainty and major unexpected events. Both the occurrence and when it occurs are both impacted by that. So here's a good, kind of a graphical example of that. Your forecast might be the blue columns there, but the range can be expressed and as you see, the range gets larger as it goes farther into the future. Those outcomes can vary within that range. They might be, you can see, well below where the blue column is, or well above it. And you'd have to describe what is influencing that range. What are the uncertainties that are causing you to open that range up? It doesn't have to be as linear as this depicts it. This is just an example. You might have really solid information for 5 years out. Let's say maybe you've got a contract that's, a 5-year option, years goes to 5 years out. So you've got set pricing, you've got structured delivery schedules, and you've got good contractor performance to date to say that they're likely to perform in that way. You might have a very narrow range for the first 5 years, and then have a much wider range to say, well, now we have to recompete, and we might have a new contractor, or you have a different market environment. All those things kind of get introduced to it. So it doesn't always have to be such a perfect wedge. It might be very tight and then open up later on because things are going to change in the future. It's important, as we said, you've got to be able to reforecast when you get new information. And sometimes that new information is qualitative, not just quantitative. It might be a policy change. It might be something that changes the contracting requirements for a given area. Maybe for an IT contracting area, now some other board or review process has to be cleared before the award can be made, and that wasn't done in the past. So that could impact your forecast. It might be economic changes. Maybe a major market player in a given area exits the market. They just decide they're not going to do it anymore for their business reasons, and you're left in more of a sole source environment, which might make part of the acquisition easier, but might change the price assumptions a great deal. So there's those things that happen. Again, they're not numeric, they're qualitative. And then lastly, operational issues. Maybe you've got a contracting officer or a contracting, team that's really on top of a certain action, and they leave or someone retires, and now a new team is in place, and they're kind of learning as they go, or kind of climbing that learning curve again. That can have an impact on it. Again, those are all things that can affect the forecast that aren't about the cost or the numbers. Your execution review should focus on identifying what that relevant new information is. So what, in cross-functional terms, because again, it's not always about the budget. It might be from the acquisition side. It might be the human resources side. What's changed such that it might impact the forecast either favorably or unfavorably. So it's important to go outside the budget world and to look for that input from other sources as well. And lastly, it's always important to be able to explain why a forecast has changed. No decision maker wants to think they have a forecast going forward and it shows a certain expenditure rate, or when obligations will occur, and at the next periodic meeting, all of a sudden the forecast says something's going to happen months later than they planned and cost a lot more. You've got to be able to articulate what those changes were. Maybe they were changes, as I said, in those other things, but it's important to have that, readily available and, understandable by the information user, so they know, what's changed, so they can be comfortable with that. None of us like to, be planning a picnic and find out now the weather says it's going to rain all day, whereas last night when we went to bed, it said it was going to be beautiful. So we'd like to understand what's changed about that. So where do you start? I mean, okay, we're talking about a lot of factors and things. Well, you really, you start with the data. You need to get data on historic and current cost levels and actions. So this is best found typically in your financial reporting system. You want to get down to the lowest level of detail that's available in there, whether it's individual contracts or individual travel authorizations, get it at that level because it's always easier to summarize it than to try to dig down below that, especially if you've got major contracts. Some contracts have multiple elements. They might have a fixed price element, a cost plus award fee element, and those sort of things. So you need to understand those elements independently. It's really, this is time when the budget analysts, go back and kind of do their homework and find out what's gone on in the past and understand what those situations were. It's also important in that sense to understand what events in the past might have influenced that behavior. So again, COVID is the one that we all can easily think of, but even things like, was there a long CR 3 years ago that drove how things were done that year? Maybe the CR went for 6 months instead of typical three months or so, and that impacted when things occurred.
Excuse me.
Sorry.
The ASL interpreters need you to slow down just a little bit, please.
Okay, sorry.
All right, thank you so much.
But it's important to be aware of those events that might be buried in the data so that whether or not that year is comparable to what you're projecting. So for a good example, travel budgets in FY20 are almost useless for doing any sort of projection because COVID, so messed up everything. So those numbers are not going to be useful for, trying to decide what your travel budget is likely to be in a couple of years. And so you have to understand those things within the data, not just the numbers. You want to work with the program and acquisition staffs, especially on major contracts, to see what their timelines are looking like. When are they planning to have contract actions awarded, or production changes? If it's a major systems acquisition, they go from limited production to full production. Those sort of milestones definitely need to be reflected in the budget forecast. In fact, it might be important because it also might denote a change in a type of appropriation. They might be going from a procurement appropriation to an operating and maintenance appropriation. And so those are important things to understand in the background of the data or in what their plans are. You might want to understand, for a given type of contract area, what's the typical period it takes to award a contract? Is it a simple thing that goes out in 90 days and, kind of gets obligated and off you go? Or is it a complex item that's going to take, maybe even more than a year, more than a fiscal year to award, and the forecast has to span that horizon to know when those funds are going to be required. And, again, travel is an area gets a lot of attention. It's not often a lot of money in this space, but it often is influenced by the time of year. Does your agency, if you're a scientific agency, maybe there's a major scientific conference in your area's discipline that occurs every May. And, that's always been the first weekend in May. You can plan on that for your forecast. It might even affect your apportionment. You don't need money apportioned to cover that until the second quarter. You can build that in if it has that sort of consistency in it. So understanding all those things is vital to making sure the forecast is as accurate as it might be. So some tips on building your model. So be able to incorporate new actual data as it becomes available. So like we said, you've got to incorporate that data to make it more accurate. And it's got to be at the same level of detail as the historic data. You don't want to have part of the data being at a very low level of detail and then just sort of very broad brush figures to kind of round it out, because it won't translate. It won't be able to sort of go back and forth between, well, what does this number out here mean? It's not based in the same line items as it was before. The intake process has to be automated, if automated ideally, but at least something that's not going to take longer than the information is good for. And what I mean by that is, if it's so complex and so tedious to update your forecast because you have to enter all this data manually and it takes you 5 weeks to do it, well, then by the time you enter April's data, May will be over and you're just going to get, sort of more and more behind. And so ideally, with the electronic systems, with the financial reporting, you deal all with that in electronic reports and you can update that data very quickly. That way it stays recent and current. Otherwise, like I said, you're just going to get behind in trying to do a manual update process. You want to be able to use the most current, recent data. So, if you've got data that's, typically in the non-personnel side, it's more like every month, but it might be more often than that if you can. It might be, you want, daily updates on what was awarded the night before. If you can incorporate that, even better. Keep that actual data refresh as often as possible. In some cases, you're going to have to apply inflationary factors to areas where you don't have a good, understanding of you don't have more specific information. You just have to escalate it using a best case scenario. There, what's available. You might be able to find a reference. Maybe OMB has tables of economic assumptions and the analytical perspectives of the president's budget that show consumer price index, figures that they're projecting into the future. Maybe that can be helpful. Maybe there's an index used by industry for, cost of materials or cost of, different elements in that competitive area that you can use. Wherever you can find a recognized reference like that to base your assumptions on, it strengthens your forecast. So it's not just, your good idea or your guess at what's going to be. It's, informed experts in that area and you're using their input for your model. That always strengthens things and always makes it more defensible. It's also important to be able to accommodate what if scenarios and changes. So, an area like, greater or lesser inflation. What does this look like if we have 5% inflation versus 3%? What does it look like if these awards slip, 3 months or a quarter of the fiscal year? Being able to save those different versions, or what I call assumption sets, and compare them is really vital. It's very helpful to be able to show them sort of at the same time, to show that range of where, the outcomes might occur. If you can only sort of do one at a time, it makes it harder and harder to, see that range come out about where things might happen just because of those different assumptions. And lastly, it's important to, report the projections in ways useful to your leadership and at the level of detail they find informative. You're not going to show a service secretary or an agency agency head the same data you might show a program manager or a division head or a branch chief. And the data ideally is scalable and, can be, the data cube can be manipulated to show those decision makers the level of detail they need and want to see. And so they're not either bogged down in too much detail or summarized at a level that becomes, kind of meaningless to what they need to decide at the moment. So to review a little bit, and please put your answers in the chat, what are the core principles of forecasting? Input the most accurate info you can. The data is important. Think probabilistically. Reforecast with more info. Yeah, that's one of them. Yeah, inflation rates. So here's the kind of the three that we really want to make sure you walk away with is, as we said, think probabilistically and not deterministically. Make short and long-term forecasts with the understanding that shorter forecasts will be more accurate than longer ones, just the nature of the beast. And reforecast when you get in more information, and that can be qualitative as well as quantitative. When new facts come to light, you want to see how those impact your forecast. All right, and with that, over to you, Andy.
Okay, thanks, Brett. Oh, okay. I keep getting muted. I'm not sure why. So forecasting is not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? So different forecasting approaches are needed for different. Really, it's about the size of your what you're forecasting and the number of items that are involved in each object class. Because really, forecasting non-personal services is also driven you're kind of doing separate forecasts for each object class in some cases. And really the decision point on which approach to use is this number of items. So when you have a large number of items, you need to go a statistical method, right? And use statistics to generate your forecast. But if you have a small number of items, if you're a smaller agency, you actually can do what we call item forecast. And that's, actually analyze specific items to figure out what they're likely to do in the next year. So next slide. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, the most common practice is to use last year's budget to forecast next year's budget, right? And this is based on assumption that it's do it like last year, dilly. And this is a very common forecasting method. You just assume that last year is going to be the same as this year's. And it does work if your program is stable and it's kind of the same every year. But dilly becomes a problem because it's often inaccurate because change is inevitable, right? Now, simple changes like inflation, you can do a dilly budget and add a few percent and you're kind of good to go. But things also change in the quantities of purchase, the program demand can change. There's timing issues, and there's always the black swan event, which is a low probability, high impact event, which we've all been through with COVID and financial crises and war in Ukraine and things like that. So dilly's kind of a risk, right? So using historical cost is a valid approach, but you really have to be thoughtful about it and think about what factors might cause change and how you have to adjust your dilly forecast. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the ways to do that is to focus, and we did talk a lot about that this morning, is using the concept of cost drivers to quote, drive your forecast. And this is very useful for organizations that produce discrete goods or services, that actually have outputs that you can measure. And a cost driver is a variable such as a level of activity or volume that causally affects costs over time. It drives costs, hence the name. And here's some examples that we can think about. Think about a fee for service contract, such as a contract that sets the price for producing a physical for disability claims. VA does this for their disability programs. Or a contract that provides the number of training sessions or trips, right? And there you have a very clear cost driver for, if it's the physical example, the more physicals you do, the greater the cost. And things like claim process and calls to help desks and things like that. But cost drivers do require you to think about a detailed understanding of where the cost is coming from. And we talked about in the earlier class today, about using activity-based costing or statistical analysis and things like that to figure out what the cost drivers are. The cost forecast is then often used is based on the volume of the cost driver. So the assumption is that there's a linear relationship or a statistical relationship between the number of the cost drivers, and it might be the number of people or the number of trainings, and the cost. It is important to think about the nature of production functions, and we had more detail about this in the earlier class, but think about the economies of scales and the different types and structures of production functions. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And we can use statistics to forecast, and we don't have time to go into the details of that. Maybe that could be a subject for a future class, but statistics are useful when you have large numbers. And the most common method is an average cost, right? You just take your cost and you divide it by the number of widgets, and that gives you an average cost. But you have to be aware of the assumption of normal distribution. If you're using average cost, you're assuming, as you can see in the picture to the right, that it's a normal distribution. But reality things can be biased. It can be biased towards one side or the other of the distribution. Now, statistics is almost always uses data from the past to project onto the future. That's kind of what it does. And so you need a lot of data. And there are, and again, this is beyond the scope of this class, there are regression techniques that may be used for advanced forecasting. And there's, you can take courses on it. There's books on it. And important to note that Excel has a powerful regression tools built into it. And you can actually, you don't need to go out and buy some fancy statistical package. You can do, decent forecasting with Excel using statistics. Next slide. I just wanted to point this out because this is a kind of new concept, but Agile, some of you may be familiar with Agile software management techniques. And there is a whole school of thought now on agile forecasting. Agile forecasting techniques may be used for large-scale software projects and other things that you manage using agile principles. The National Academy of Public Administration is pushing the concept of agile management in government, and you can go to their website and learn more about that. But the focus of analysis is on the concept of cycle time, our production runs. And it rejects statistical analysis of using average cost in favor of a concept of percentiles. And again, we don't have the ability to go into this, but I just want to make you aware that these concepts are out there. So if you have a problem, you can do your research and maybe use these tools because they're out there. So let's go to the next slide. What's the most common approach to forecasting and what are its drawbacks? It's got a nice little word that describes it. Dilly, yeah, I love the concept of do it like last year. I don't know how many times in my government when someone has said, well, we did it that way last year, and that actually drives a lot of forecasting. So what are the drawbacks? Oh, okay, we got the answers up there, but inflation you can handle, that you can handle, but things change. Change is the big forecast. Okay, is there any questions over what we've covered so far? Because if not, we're gonna go to a break. Okay, great. And we'll come back at 2 o'clock, I guess. We'll take 10 minutes. Thank you. Hey, Rick, you're picking up at 37, right? You there? Oh. Okay, we'll be back in about 2 minutes. Hey, Rick,
Yes.
you're going to take back over at side 37. Is that what we said?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, just about a minute. We'll start. Start right at 2. Okay. Okay, well, let's, excuse me, let's get started. We're going to talk about forecasting by item. And next slide. Okay, an item forecast is really just a compilation of what specific things that you are expected to purchase over the period of the forecast. And this obviously applies to smaller agencies or an office within a big agency. And sometimes the way budgets are built is you do these item level forecasts and you build them up, you add them all up. And so you think about the different object classes and the different things that you're going to buy. And it can be things like trips and contracts and rental spaces and software projects, and anything that's, like we said at the beginning, not a people related, not a salary or benefit. And then you try to figure out the expected cost of each item and just sum it all up. It's really just that simple. And most offices, they just create a spreadsheet and they just track it down. And often what they do is they ask program offices, tell us what your travel is going to be, tell us what your rent's good. Well, rent's usually central managed, so maybe that's not a good example, but tell us what your contracts are. And you create a form, you have people fill it out, and then you kind of add it up. And it can be a variation from the list that you used in the formulation process. So there are issues with that. And let's go to the next slide. Here again, when you're dealing at the item level, using just inflation factors may not be a good process. You really have to delve into the specifics to understand, for example, what is the escalation that has been written into the contracts for if you're doing a contract, or maybe you'll find that travel has changed, if you're doing trips or contractors that provide training. And there can be benchmark references to interest rates that may have changed. And then there are organizations that allow you that provide information on specific pricing. For example, the Defense Logistic Agency has information on fuel prices and GSA contract schedules and rates. And you can work with GSA to get the rent adjustments. And GSA then also can issue changes to per diem and mileage reimbursables and meals and things like that. So it's hard often to get the specific costs for specific items because that's a detail. That's why at a certain level you have to move to some sort of statistical analysis. So next slide. Now, milestone or event-driven activities are another thing to think about, because especially when you're dealing with a large acquisition programs that needs, they do big obligations not very often, and then they draw them down. And I just pulled this slide or picture from the GAO, and it shows you how you might have a contract for research and development, then another one for investment and operating support and disposal. So there may be 5 or 6 different contracts over the life cycle of a major project, and you need to understand what are the cost estimates for these contracts. Now, part of the issue, though, is when you're dealing with contracts, you have the government estimated cost of a contract, but you really don't want to put that out there too much, because that tells the people bidding on the contract what the cost is going to be. And it's, you don't want that. You want them to put the lowest bid in possible, so you don't want to tell people what you expect. So there's the issue here. You have to understand you're making forecasts for contracts that aren't awarded yet. And that is, problematic and something you have to think about. So there is technology, though, or I'm sorry, techniques on the next slide for cost estimating for major acquisitions. Every budget proposal and every forecast should use these techniques that are from GAO. And then I put a pretty good book on the side there that basically focuses on DoD practices for cost estimation, which civilian agencies can benefit from. And then those cost estimates become the basis for your forecast. GAO does say there are 4 characteristics of a reliable cost estimate. It has to be comprehensive, well-documented, accurate, and credible. And so I would encourage you to take some look at this GAO cost estimating and assessment guide, which has the best practices for developing and managing program costs. But these same techniques can be used to develop your forecast. And that's just the point I'm trying to make here. Use cost estimating techniques for making forecasts. So let's go to the next slide. Oftentimes you want to do a hybrid approach. For individual forecasts for key high dollar items like, major contracts, and also items that are important to operations if they're going to have an impact if they're not funded and done. And then you can use the item approach. But then for the rest, you can just use inflation adjustments or a statistical approach with average approach. So you can focus in on your items on the key things that really matter, and then other things you can just use, broader rules of thumb. So with that, I will turn it over to Rick.
Thank you, Andy. So what we wanted to do in this section is to go through some of the common budget object classes and give you some sort of, maybe tips and tricks or, things that we've discovered over the years that make, specific estimates in these areas, more insightful. And so we'll get started with that. So the first one is, which the budget object classes we're dealing with. And it's the main ones in the non-personnel space: travel, rent and utilities, other contractual services, supplies and materials, equipment, grants, and some of the others. And also within that, we'll talk a little bit about IT, since it touches multiple object classes. So BOC 21, or transportation of persons, travel. So those are mostly event driven. So you need to understand the requirements around that. There's also might be training elements. So maybe your organization has job categories that have a required training period at, like, the National Law Enforcement Training Center or the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. There might be 12 weeks each, recruit has to spend there at the academy for your officers. And so that for each officer you join or each officer you plan on hiring, you've got to factor in that 12 weeks of travel cost. And so, that sort of thing that can shape it. Or as I said, if you've got recurring conferences that your agency participates in, that may be something. Another wrinkle I've encountered over the years is some international organizations or professional organizations do an alternating schedule where one year the conference will be outside the United States, and then the next year it will be in the United States. And so that sort of back and forth is something you can budget into your travel projections where necessary. So, again, the previous year might look a little cheaper, but then you've got to remember that, oh yeah, next year, we've got to travel people to Singapore, and that's going to be more expensive, and we can factor that into our forecast. You want to use your estimate costs for current and projected rates for all travel categories. So GSA is good about publishing, the per diem rates and the city pair rates that they award to airlines. That information is available on the GSA websites. You can find that, and that can inform how your travel estimates are being done. Those references are out there, so it doesn't have to just be estimating it from last year and those sort of things. And of course, remember that 2020 and 2021 are likely not representative of future requirements. So, including those years, even in a statistical process, are a little bit dangerous because they're likely to be outliers to the low side and might pull your average down artificially. Another thing that, this is a great example of is the increased use of virtual meetings may have, changed your travel estimates forever. And they just may not see as much travel as you have in the past if more and more meetings are being done completely virtual. That's something you can change over time, but again, it's been sort of a functional shift in this area that may continue and need to be factored into future forecasts. And as I said, stay informed about upcoming changes in GSA's rates. Those are pretty, they're communicated in advance of the fiscal year, maybe not by a lot, but it is helpful to be able to look those up and find those online. And again, it makes your budget estimate, your budget forecast more defensible when you can reference it back to an outside source. All right, we'll go on to the next one. So BOC 23, rent, communication, and utilities. So this is kind of a weird one. There's all sorts of things in this budget object class at the lower levels. If your agency has direct leasing authority, it'll be in your appropriation language. You may have rental payments directly to private entities. In other words, you may have rental payments to others, not to just GSA. And those are in object class 23.2. So you can look that up again in your accounting and your financial history and see if you've had obligation in that area in the past. If you do, then you're really going to have to work with your facilities people, your logistics people to see how those rent agreements are structured, how the cost is done, whether or not there's any sort of bubbles in the payments for physical improvements to the property or maintenance issues. Property tax can influence those rates. So it all depends. Most agencies lease from GSA, and it's a pretty straightforward year-to-year thing, but it's still useful to look at those agreements and to see what exactly is, the buildings being leased. Does the agency plan to expand or contract on that space? I would suspect, and this is just supposition on my part, that with the increased use of telework, as it becomes more and more permanent, agencies might be reducing their physical footprint. And therefore, just because last year your agency leased 25,000 square feet from GSA may not necessarily mean you'll have the same leasing going forward. So that's an important thing to ask about and to follow up on. One of the weird things in here is IT communication costs. And a lot of that goes back to the days when if you wanted a higher speed connection between 2 points, you had to lease a telephone cable, literally pay the telephone company to give you access to that cable. Almost everything now is done IP, and it's much more sort of liquidated and diluted because you're paying for your IP, internet access. But you might still have dedicated lines, especially to remote or foreign areas, that those contracts need to be looked at and understand what their cost behavior is going to be. Does your agency pay utility costs directly? Again, cell phone service is often one, but if you have a lot of small regional offices or, again, space that's not rented through GSA, you may have utility contracts, local electric utilities, local natural gas utilities, local cable connections for their data. So those things need to be understood. And again, it's part of understanding your operational environment. The other thing that's in here, and it's just tradition, are express services like UPS and FedEx services. Sometimes these are in 23, sometimes they're in 22 because they're considered transportation of things. And, it just depends on what your agency's background is. So again, understanding how your agency has budgeted for those things in the past avoids the problem of having, money in one object class and needing it in another. But again, you can look at whether or not the traffic, let's say to FedEx is likely to go up or down because now you now can share files electronically versus having to, put them in a tube and mail them to somebody or FedEx them to somebody. So, that's gone down, in my experience, a great deal from when I started my career when, the fastest way we had to get something anywhere was a fax machine. And if it didn't go in that, then we had to put it in an envelope and mail it or FedEx it to somebody. BOC 25. So BOC 25, other contractual services, captures a great deal of a range of contracts. And so we're only going to kind of talk, in a summary fashion because there's so many details, that can be captured in BOC 25. The best thing I can tell you is to coordinate with your procurement office and understand acquisition plans and terms, especially of your major contracts, the major dollar value contracts or the ones that have a large operational impact on your agency. What are the important ones? And then work with them to suss out the planned obligation pattern for that contract. Is it going to obligate a major award every year, every 2 years? What are the task order structure? How's that going to work? Are there major milestones that indicate acquisition plan is on track? That backs up that schedule because, well, if they achieve this milestone, then we know this award is coming soon after. But if they're late, then we have some uncertainty we might have to reforecast for because the award is going to take place later. Again, focus on the major contracts. It's easy to kind of get lost in the weeds of all the small dollar value, smaller contracts. As Andy was talking about, those are really better done with a kind of a statistical or a top-down process. It's the big ones that you want to concentrate your effort on, the ones that have a material effect on whether or not you're fully obligating your resources. Of course, one of the big things in this area are IT contracts. They touch this, they go into several different areas. We'll talk about them a little bit more, but those have really unique circumstances because sometimes their purchases are considered equipment because you're developing software. Sometimes they're considered communications because you're leasing communication type space. It could be a combination of all those within one contract. So again, like any other major contract, it's get into it, understand it the best you can. I always say to beware of these one-time contracts that someone says, oh, we're just going to do this one time and we're not going to need this funding next year. And it seems like more often than not, all of a sudden those become recurring contracts. So especially if they have a larger dollar value that kind of sets off your radar, then be especially careful about them and watch them carefully because it's a one-time contract, but then all of a sudden if, well, we decided to use that again next year, we need that $2 million back, that can kind of bite you and kind of blow up your forecast. So those are ones just to kind of, look at and be sure that they're really going to be a one-time contract and not turn into a recurring thing. And next we've got a decision tree we'll talk about for forecasting contracts. So this is just an effort to try to lay out kind of the what you're looking at here, to structure the contracts and kind of guide you to sort of an approach that might be helpful. So first of all, is it a development or a support contract? Development meaning something new, something that hasn't been done before, software development or something of that nature. Or is it a support contract? Is it something you've done before? It's to maintain your fleet of vehicles, let's say maybe, or it's to support an app that's been up for years. It's well understood. It's well documented. Those have different natures, and that's why the first decision or the first question is it development or support? If it's development, is it ongoing? Is it, year 3 of a 5-year project? Or is it, year 1? Or is it coming to completion? If it's coming to completion and it's about ready to roll out or finish, whatever it developed, then it's, is it a disposal or termination funding? Maybe that's a different color of money. What are the follow-on requirements? If we've had this, let's say maybe it's a travel app in our mainframe and we've used it for 25 years, but now we're going to, bring it to an end and do something new. What are those follow-on requirements? What funding is going to be necessary to fund the replacement system for this one that we're end of lifing? So those are important questions to ask about that. And if it's ongoing, kind of before it switches over to being more of a support contract, when and how much additional funding is needed? Is it going to need a plus up when it goes from, well, we introduced this and now there's, a per user cost that has to be paid, or additional hardware or communications that have to be acquired so that we can roll this out nationwide? Those are important questions to ask on that side of the tree. On the support side, is it a variable or fixed support? Variable in the sense is that is it, so much per unit, for every physical therapy exam, like Andy was talking about, that the vendor does, you have to pay them a certain price. Or is it fixed? It's a support to provide, so many man years of effort or work years of effort, let's say support of your IT infrastructure, and it's pretty solid. It's going to be 200 people a month for 12 months. It's, pretty much laid out. It's pretty linear. On the variable side too are price adjustments. Sometimes multi-year contracts especially will have written into them cost escalation factors, and it might be a reference to a benchmark. So it might say that, the price for each year is set by taking the base price and multiplying it by this reference rate that shows up, it's referenced in the Wall Street Journal or, the New York Times or something like that. There are benchmark rates often used for that, and that will set what the new rate is. So you need to go look for that and see what that rate's going to be, what its behavior has been over time. Has it been going up or down? And take a look at that. And that way you can, kind of be aware and realize whether your forecast is kind of going up or down. Another variable support contract like that is fuel. So, we've all experienced what gas prices have done up and down. And so if you have a fuel contract that you have to use, you want to understand how the prices per gallon of those fuels changes and what controls how that change is done. Another big thing again in this area is timing. So, whether or not your contracts are awarded, during the fiscal year, when in the fiscal year is very important. So I would hope everyone sort of by now has heard of the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act and its impact on severable contract awards, right? This is the idea that you can obligate a year's worth of support anytime during the year. It doesn't have to be done October 1st. That's kind of been around a while, but if that's something you haven't heard of before, maybe chat with us after we're done and we can answer some questions about that. But that's a tremendous thing so that you don't have all your contracts awarding early in the fiscal year, especially in the reality of recurrent CRs. When a CR occurs for the first quarter of the year, and some agencies take the approach that, if the CR is for 1/3 of the year, they fund all their contracts at 1/3 if they can. That can be problematic. It creates a lot of work, a lot of transactions. Other agencies have taken the approach where they look at the critical contracts that need funding during that time, and they fund them using the CR funding, and the other contracts are set up so that they need funding outside that likely CR window. Every place I've been the last few years, we've tried very hard to shift our contract awards out of the first and maybe even out of the second quarter if we can. So that way we're not dealing with contract funding issues during a likely CR period. So again, if you'd like to hear more about that, we can talk at a break or talk afterwards. Also, remember, if your agency has multi-year or no-year funding, you have a lot more flexibility about your contract awards. You can use that multi-year or no-year funding to award multiple years on a contract. So if you have, no-year funding, you can, obligate 3 years worth of funding on a contract to get that support locked in for those 3 years. Again, work that out with your accounting and your appropriations law staff to make sure they're on board with it. But that is a possibility that can give you some flexibility and also some certainty in your projections. The one thing there that, everything kind of circles back is, so you'll have a big obligation in this year and you won't have any other obligations for that requirement for the next 2 years. So in your history, you have to know that, last year, just because there wasn't an obligation doesn't mean, I'm coming up on a new renewal. So it does add a little complexity, but it gives you a lot of certainty in knowing that a contract's going to be funded despite the verities of the appropriation process. Okay, so I think that's done with 25. We can move on to BOC 26. Supplies and materials. So again, it really depends on your agency. For a lot of agencies, this might be copier paper and office supplies and pretty, mundane, pretty regular stuff. But it might not be. Supplies includes fuel. So if you're an agency that has a lot of vehicles, whether you're a National Park Service or a defense agency, or whether it's airplanes or boats or automobiles, that can drive a lot of change in the supplies and materials budget because of fuel. So it's, again, it can be very simple, but it can be complex. Another reality is that a lot of agencies have to buy their fuel from Defense Logistics Agency or other consolidators like that. And so you're kind of beholden to them for what the rates are going to be. And so it's important to work with your DLA contacts and look for their pricing information and to stay up to date on what their prices are projected to be. If their fuel prices change, then that's going to change. It might impact how many hours or how many miles you can operate those vehicles, if you don't have the budget flexibility to respond to that. And IT sometimes hits in this area too. Some IT stuff is actually a supply. It's not considered equipment. So it's possible that IT might show up in this area for some consumables or from some small items. BOC 31, and of course it says equipment, but I think for a lot of agencies, it's more typically software, especially if it's software development, because you're developing an asset, and the BOC 31 aligns with the asset, which then supports the depreciation calculations. And so a lot of times BOC 31 is used instead of maybe 25. But one of the things to look out for is, will completed or purchased assets in 31 later require support in BOC 25 or supplies in BOC 26 when they're put into service? So you might have a software development contract where you pay $2 million because it's seen as a capital expenditure to develop the software, but from then on, the recurring support for that contract from the vendor is considered a service and is over in BOC 25. So just because the equipment obligation kind of comes to an end doesn't mean the support for that system might be over, and it might have to also be in a separate object class. So again, you've got to understand the details of what's needed to support that system. And again, supplies, maybe if it's a physical thing, it's a generator or a system of some sort of physical system, maybe it's going to have a fuel or maintenance requirement that has to be dealt with too in those other object class. So as we talked about non-capitalized and capitalized, that's the idea that, capitalized assets have typically a useful life over of 2 to 5 years, depending on your agency defines it. And those have to be depreciated in the accounting system to recognize, those costs each year that the asset is in service. The only thing I can tell you with that is work with your accounting staff, refer to your accounting guidance, because this varies by agency, how they define it. And this is also where 3 and 4-digit BOC levels are used to differentiate things. So, but it's important to be cognizant of that, aware of it, and know, where you've got to deal with those issues. And again, IT really impacts these issues. So we'll deal with IT a little bit more on the next slide. So IT, again, they're highly visible and they have a lot of specific guidance. I'm going to go over the thing on the next slide from A11 that talks about some of the, guidance about where IT obligations have to be posted. But, that is part of that complexity. Part of it too is that IT marketplace is comprised of many sub-markets with very different dynamics. So, cloud storage might be dominated by a couple, few very major vendors, but there might be niches and, kind of corners that have lots of competition in them or very few. And so knowing how those IT marketplace pressures affect the pricing of the contracts can be very important. It might mean that, as Andy mentioned, your independent cost estimate, will be okay because there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of, different companies working to get that work. And so they're going to sharpen their pencil and really make sure they make a good bid. However, if you're in an area where there's only 1 or 2, competitors, there might be less pressure to, provide such an aggressive bid or offer on doing the work. And so you may find your government cost estimate maybe doesn't take that into account, especially if there's been recent consolidation or expansion of the number of vendors in a given market area. That dynamic could have changed since that estimate was done. Some things in the IT market space get cheaper and cheaper over time. So memory and storage traditionally has dropped as new technologies have come on board. You can store a gigabyte of data now for much, much less than it used to be 10 years ago. We now walk around with, terabyte, SD cards, in devices, whereas before a terabyte would have taken up a room to store it. So it really depends on the technology pressures that things are driving cost performance in different areas. Software, again, can be highly driven by the maturity of the particular application. Who has the hottest new app and what are they charging for your agency to use it? Is it a mature thing like Office, desktop automation software, your word processor, your spreadsheet, those sort of things. But if it's a new analytics software that only one company has, then obviously there's going to be a different market dynamic in place that's going to guide how much that's likely to cost. And it's going to make that estimate more challenging, in doing your forecast of those costs. So it makes sense to work with your IT program managers to understand that competitive forces and their impact on pricing. They're the ones that are closest to it. They're the ones really working, in it every day, and they can probably have a better feel for that and inform you about what's going on with that. So here's from the A11 about, it's a good, kind of reference about where different obligations need to go. And you can see that IT crosses a bunch. IT services are the rental of equipment. There we are back in object class 23. So again, it depends. It's not always clear where they go. Operation and maintenance of IT systems by the private sector, 25.7. Operations or maintenance of IT by a federal government account, also 25.7. And I think that's interesting because in my experience, a lot of agencies have put that into, I think it's 25.3, which are interagency agreements. But A11 says that even if it's maintained by a federal government account, it should be in 25.7. As I said, IT hardware and software, often in equipment or object class 31. So again, it's important whether or not those are going to be there, or maybe it's considered, sometimes licenses are considered a maintenance type thing and go in 27 because you never actually own the software. So again, it's important to work with the accounting staff and be consistent with how they're dealing with things. IT supplies and materials, manuals, toner cartridges, any sort of that sort of thing is going to be in 26. I think it's cute that they mentioned diskettes, which none of us have seen probably in 20 years, but it's still mentioned in there in the guidance. And then IT consulting is yet another sort of beast. A11 says 25.1, but sometimes that, agency history has it in some other places. So again, I'd work with that, heavily lean on the A11, but also look how your agency has done things in the past. And, maybe your agency practices need to be adapted to A11, or maybe you've got a good reason and history why you're using something slightly different. So I'm not saying this is prescriptive, just that, this is what the A11 guidance projects as where these obligations should be posted and budgeted for. Grants. So for budgeting purposes, grants behave much like contracts in that they have to have budget authority requested so that it's available at the time the grant award is to be made. Each grant can be very unique. So this is just an area where you have to say, you've got to understand what's going on in your grant, portfolio to know what the, history is and what's likely to affect it. So those principles of forecasting could be, will be heavily applied here to grants. So these are the kind of the other BOCs, I'll say. Again, some agencies might use them a great deal. Many agencies hardly have anything in these areas. So Object Class 22, transportation of things, shipping. Again, maybe your FedEx contract or UPS contract shows up here. Maybe you do use freight carriers to move equipment around the country. And so you might have, a large amount of obligations here for your agency. It just really depends on your agency's practices and what you do. Printing and reproduction, another area that for many agencies is very small, kind of routine, but one of the things that shows up here is internet charges. So if you have to pay an ISP to host an agency website or something of that nature, you might have charges here to support that. And so again, it really depends on what you're doing. The other thing that shows up here is payments to the government printing office. Those show up in printing and reproduction. If you're having them print pamphlets or, public notification type things, that's going to show up here. BOC 32, land and structures. So again, if your agency has legal authority to independently purchase land to be held by the government and constructs buildings, then you may have obligations here. That's become more and more restrictive over time. Most agencies must go through GSA to acquire land or buildings, and in fact they then lease them from GSA, and GSA holds title to the buildings on behalf of the government. But again, if you've got it, take a look at past history and see what's going on in that object class to see what you might need to do there. BOC 33, investments and loans, are also called credit reform. Again, some agencies are heavily involved in this area and many aren't. And so we won't go into it exactly, but that's an area to look for to see if your agency has exposure there. I think you'll know if you do because of the other attention and guidance about credit reform. 42, insurance claims and indemnities. Actually, Social Security and OPM have very large obligations here. This is how they fund their programs, or in BOC 42. Again, most other agencies have very, very small, if any, charges here. 43 is also a credit reform BOC. So again, if you're in the credit reform type program, you're going to have stuff there. BOC 44 refunds is very rare. I can't think of a situation where it's used. It's very rarely used in some other cases, as is 91 through 94. They are very rare and most likely zero at most agencies, but they're in the table, so I wanted to just mention that they're there and maybe something to look at. A lot of it you can find by looking at old president's budgets or old financial statements and to see if there's any activities in those BOCs. So a question here, what are the common factors that are present in nearly all forecasts for non-personnel costs? Inflation, yeah, that's one. Timing. Historical behavior, sure. Black swan, yep, I got that one, so I'm pleased to see that one because that was on the list as well. So yeah, I mean, almost everything is affected by inflation. And market events, again, they might be positive or in the agency's, benefit because there's a lot of competition that drives prices down, or they could be, a problem because there's one or two vendors and there's just not as much pressure to keep prices low. So it really depends on, the market segment for the thing you're buying. Again, the timing is critical because timing can mean an entire requirement will move out of the fiscal year window and leave you with unobligated funds that need to be reallocated. So that timing is very critical. If you have a major assumption that something's going to happen, especially towards the end of the year, and it slips, that can leave you with a lot of unobligated balance to deal with. And of course, black swans are both, tough to plan for, but do occur and, kind of need to be thought about. All right, so that's the end of our prepared slides. So now we're prepared. Andy and I can take any questions you might have. We're happy to discuss anything. If think it's okay if you want to just come up on the go off mute and ask us instead of having to maybe type them. We're happy to do what we can to answer your questions.
Well, it's been a long couple of days. We really appreciate your participation. And we do, I just want to, we're going to turn it over to Janice in a minute, but I do want to really, if you could fill out the survey, it would be very helpful to us to give us any comments because we do want to get better. We want to do better courses in the future. We'd also like to know topics that you might want to cover. So Janice is going to make that pitch, but I'm going to please encourage you to do that. So enough.
I saw someone with their hand up, so if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, my hand is up there.
Hi.
My name's Lacine. Question for you. I know that there was some statement there that you are a very good speaker. You speak very fast, and then I said, okay, so how somebody could speak so fast for half an hour? But anyway, my question is this. It's hard to find a good training for federal entity program as to specific to the area that you are speaking of. Is a way that this could be structured so then federal employee could take a full advantage of this sort of training and then material that follow? Because the resources are so I've been from the beginning to today, I've been following every part of your session, and the way it's presented, the way it get to the specific to the point, and then an area that is more concerned, that is area that are not lease interagency lease agreement, for instance, that's another area that a lot of people don't know that the GSA do certain things, travel, those kind of things. So for me personally, this is a kind of a way that I want to express it, to follow you around so that at least I could stay updated. Definitely my personal opinion is that it will refresh everything that I learned in the past. Thank you so much.
Well, I just will say that if you go to the Max to the Budget Line of Business website, and Janice can guide you there are about 50 of our old classes that we've delivered. And they're on a
that's where I sign up. That's where I sign up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we also have a YouTube channel, and you can type budget line of business into YouTube, and you can go see a whole bunch of older classes that we given that are still, you know, they're not that old. They're like a year old, but you that's one way to follow us. And there's a lot of great classes on that YouTube channel.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I saw a question in the comments about, is there a cheat sheet or non-personnel items that fit into certain BOCs? And, you know, I've got to say that the best cheat sheet is in A11. If you go into, I think it's section 83, you know, schedule O, which is the object class schedule in Max. Part of that is an appendix that lists the budget object class at the 3-digit level. So like, you know, 25.1, 25.2, 25.3. And we'll give you definitions and examples of what sort of things fit into each one of those object classes. Now, below that, at the 4 or 5-digit level that some agency uses, then you'll need to refer to your agency guidance about what needs to be allocated in those manners.
Okay, any other questions? Not, I'll turn it over to Janice, and she'll close it out.
Okay. Woo. Thank you, Rick and Andy. Thank you to everyone that joined us for the 2024 virtual spring forum of the budget line of business. Thank you if you joined us for both days or just today. Just a reminder that we will be sending out the post survey at the end of today. Please, as Andy indicated, give us some feedback so that we can definitely know what your interest is and also improving in the areas that are needed. But I'd just like to say on behalf of the budget line of business, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming training and forums. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Antonio and Renee.
Thank you so very much. It was what a pleasure. Yeah.
Just a second, I'm pulling up the budget line of business website from YouTube, if I can find it.